Benvenuti, welcome to the Lauro De Bosi's Colloquium in Italian Studies at Harvard University. I'm Elena Bellina, Lauro De Bosi's Fellow for 2019 and Assistant Professor of Italian at the University of Rochester. Today, we have the pleasure of having with us Professor Luca Cottini, the author of The Art of Objects, The Birth of Italian Industrial Culture, 1878-1928, published by Toronto University Press. Welcome, Professor Cottini, and thank you so much for being with us today.
And thank you very much for having me.
In your book, you argue that Italy's first industrialization took place very early in 1878. Italy became a creative lab in which it struggled to keep up with the major scientific advancements happening in Northern Europe. You do so by inquiring how the major scientific discoveries of those days, like watches, photographs, bicycles, gramophones, radio, furniture, toys, clothes, changed everyday life and became culturally accepted goods thanks to the work of artists, intellectuals, and writers. So with your book, you elegantly put the humanities and sciences into conversation and demonstrate how to address the debate haunting academia these days. How did you decide to deal with this dialogue between scientific knowledge and cultural discourse? And how do you see it in relation to the current debate on the humanities versus sciences?
Thank you for the question. And I would reframe the alternative between science and culture as an alternative between industry or technology and culture. However, there's no alternative between the two, in the sense that if you look at the words, the word industry means laboriousness, industriousness, whereas the word cultura, culture, refers to the realm of cultivation. So both words have to do with the same human activity of bearing fruits or preparing a soil for it to be fruitful. So in this sense, I don't see a division between the two, and I operate in the book observing industry as a cultural phenomenon and culture as an industrial phenomenon. Now, the title is The Art of Objects, but the word art in Greek is the word techne, which means both art and technology or technique. So in this sense, again, industry and art refer to the same human endeavor to produce something that is fruitful. Now, in my case, I also want to observe the phenomenon of design, of Italian design, and the birth and the origin of Italian design as a phenomenon in between the world of culture and the world of industry. Design is something that makes industry cultural, but also something that makes culture industrial.
Thank you. And could you tell us more about the genesis of your project? How and why did you select these specific objects?
So I observed the years in between 1878 and 1928, which are the years of the birth of Italian Industrial Revolution. And I observed them through the lens of all the leading newspapers of Italy, so Corriere della Sera, Illustrazione Italiana, and I observed them from within, through their ephemeral products and their ephemeral debates. As I was going through these debates, keeping in mind also the artistic and intellectual production of the age, which was contemporary to these newspapers, I observed that there were several objects that were not only entering social debates, ads, but they were also entering literature, painting, and they were becoming philosophical symbols. So I decided to focus on a few of them, wristwatches, bicycles, cigarettes, toys, photographs, which entered during the market during this period. And I realized that these objects were the target, the focus of the attention of many intellectuals. Of all the objects that entered Italy during this period, the most fascinating one is refrigeration, 1902, because refrigeration allows to create realities like cities like Miami or Los Angeles that wouldn't otherwise exist. However, no Italian writer or no Italian artist wrote or painted anything with the theme of refrigeration. Whereas on the objects that I selected, there was an investigation. These objects were not just commercial products, but they became somewhat of an icon, something else. So I decided to dwell on objects that entered the market during this period and objects that generated experiences and philosophical or cultural reflections.
And how did families or individuals coming from the Renaissance idea of bottega have brilliant intuitions about some of these objects and turn them into the industrial luxury goods Italy is still known for these days? How did they understand that they needed the help of writers, creators, designers to advertise them and turn them into refined cultural objects?
Mm-hmm. So basically, industry reinvents the old tradition of the bottega, bringing it to a mass scale. So when we talk about objects like wristwatches, we're talking about an item like clocks that has been there forever. Men has always, and women have always measured time. But industrialists reinvent these objects to bring them to a mass consumption. Now, Italy is very late compared to other nations. So the UK, France, Germany, the United States had the largest piece of the industrial development in the late 19th century, early 20th century. So in order to compensate this delay, Italian industrialists wanted to add a cultural element or an element of beauty to the industrial products produced in Italy. And in this sense, they looked for for artists and intellectuals who could transform their industrial products into products of culture. So to bypass the serialization of the industrial product and make it something unique, something beautiful. So in this sense, the Italian industrialization develops around this cultural or aesthetic charge placed upon serial items.
Can you tell us more about
Bulgari,
for instance? Yes, I was very fascinated by the example.
A lot of industries like Bulgari place their products within the setting of a timeless culture. So Bulgari started the first atelier in 1884 in Rome and placed it within the context of the Eternal City. Or Borletti, who produced who started the first Italian industry factory of clockmaking, designed this product in a cultural way, as we see from the cover of the book, by using the image of a disc thrower, the discobulus of ancient times, but holding in his hand a clock. So in this sense, this is a hybrid model of a modernity that it looks to the future, but is well anchored in the past, to the past.
And in the 1880s, Italy was still a rather young country struggling with its unification process. It was mostly a rural country, barely starting to catch up with the industrialization happening in the rest of Europe. Yet, it ended up playing a very important role in some of this global debate on timekeeping, for instance, by hosting the 1883 International Geodesic Conference in Rome. How was it possible that such a rural country could influence international scientific debate? How often did the Italian creative laboratory, as you call it, end up fostering incredible technological advancement?
So Italy in the early 1880s was looking forward to becoming one of the modern nations. One of the ways to achieve this new status for a relatively young nation that was formed only 20 years before was, like, on the one hand, the colonial enterprise. On the other hand was the industrial enterprise. So trying to finance Italy's presence at world expositions, world fairs, and to finance to fund congresses, expositions, conferences, even scientific conferences like the Geodesic Conference of 1883 in Rome, which basically set up the stage for the resolution of World Standard Time that was approved in 1884 in the Meridian Conference of DC. Italy was funding these conferences and these congresses as a way to achieve a status among the modern nations, and as a way to chase that modernity that could allow Italy to become one of the global powers. Now, in doing this, there is also a resistance that is embedded in the nation to that same modernization or modernity that it was pursuing. And the resistance was related to the fact that Italy was chasing the global dream, but also wanted to define its own distinctiveness, its own distinction. So in this sense, the attempt to follow progress but anchor it in the past was a way to define a different or a unique model to modernity, which could be like a hybrid model of modernity. We can see this in the facades of the pavilions of Italy at the Universal Expositions, where the display of the newest technological objects of the nation was put within buildings that were paying homage to the past, to the medieval Gothic style in Paris, 1878, or to actually the Oriental style, kind of a Venetian style in Paris, 1900. So we have the push towards the new, but a new that is anchored in the past as a way to achieve a new, but with distinction.
And coming from the University of Rochester, founded by George Eastman Kodak in the 1880s to sponsor his technological empire, I'm always fascinated by how Italy, and especially Torino, became the center of the new industry of the very new moving image market in the early 1900s. Could you tell us more about photography, Arturo Ambrosio, Ambrosio Films, and what it meant for Italy and for the history of Italy in the 20th century?
So you mentioned Eastman and Kodak. So in 1888, Kodak launched the first photographic camera that could separate the act of taking a picture from the act of developing the photographic image. The slogan, the very famous slogan was like, you push the button, we do the rest. Mm-hmm. So that to me starts the beginning of a new industrial awareness of photography. And in this sense, I deal with photography as an industrial product. Starting from the 1880s. Now, within this context, Turin and Florence are the two Italian capitals of photography. At the beginning, it is Florence because a lot of photographers were coming to the city to take shots of the monuments of the city. But in the late 1890s, Turin became the real capital of photography, and Turin organized the first Italian Congress of Photography in 1898. Which is a congress that featured for the first time the photographic representation of the shroud that revealed the image of the shroud, but also it's the congress from which the pictorialist movement of Italian photography started to develop. So the movement that wanted to transform the photographic act from a merely mechanical reproduction into an art. So starting from this Congress, there was a society that was founded, Società Fotografica Subalpina, from which the review, the journal Fotografia Artistica developed, which was a way of bringing to Italy something similar to camera work by Stiglitz. Now, Ambrosio is a photographer of Turin. He worked in the city. He had a studio. And he wanted to push the boundary of photography in order to transform it into an art, but also into something that could bypass the immobility of a serialized and reproducible image. So in this sense, Ambrosio is one of the pioneers of tableau vivant and is one of the pioneers of cinema in the sense that he belongs to that general push in the early 1900s toward like the creation of images, photographic images, as moving images to break that stillness that the photographic image contains. And Ambrosio, in 1907, founded the first cinematographic house of the city, so Ambrosio, which will become one of the leading cinematographic houses of the city. And as you know, Turin will become the Hollywood of silent cinema in the early 1900s, in the 1910s. It is quite remarkable that in 1907, the poet from Turin, Guido Gozzano, writes a poem, L'amica di Nonna Speranza, so Grandma Speranza's friend, which is all based about a fiction, an imaginative fiction upon a still image, photographic image from the past. So again, another attempt to break the stillness of the photographic image and transform it into an imaginative screen, what will become cinema.
And in 1902, Enrico Caruso's first opera recording with a gramophone, or o tubo, as Caruso used to call it, opened music up to a completely different market and a completely different experience of music consumption. Could you tell us more about how this industry bloomed in Italy and how Casa Ricordi, the Italian music publisher, changed the market by envisioning a new consumption of these goods?
So this is a fascinating story because it is at the intersection between industrialism, opera, and also the birth of Italian advertising. I will go back to an episode of 1895 when Giulio Ricordi presents at the first Biennale of Venice one of the posters for the operas that Casa Ricordi was sponsoring. Giulio Ricordi was the patron of Verdi and Puccini. And the poster was designed by Adolfo Hohenstein, and it was the poster for La Bohème. These advertising posters were sort of like graphic reproductions of the visual impression, of the overall impression of the opera. At the Biennale of Venice, an entrepreneur from Naples, the Mele brothers, two entrepreneurs from Naples, the Mele brothers, see this poster and start to commission to the Ricordi designers advertising posters for other products than the opera. So this is actually the beginning of the Italian advertising system. Now, what is even more complicated is what happened since 1902 when Caruso, for the first time, records in the tube, or o tubo. This is the fascinating story of an American invention, the gramophone, that was exported to Europe through agents that were traveling the different states to record the voices of famous people of the time. So one of these agents, Fred Geisberg from London, traveled to Italy to record the voice of Pope Leo XIII. And on his way from London to Rome, he stopped in Milan and was assisting to one of the operas that were performed at La Scala, Germania. And Caruso was the singer in this opera. And Geisberg saw in Caruso the perfect gramophonic voice. So out of his own pocket, he organized like a recording session of an hour in a Grand Hotel of Milan with Caruso. And that recording became like the first record that sold more than 1 million copies. And that record pretty much launched the record industry. In this sense, we have the paradox of Ricordi at this point, who is the patron of opera, that starts to advertise through his posters also gramophones who bring the opera throughout the world. They grant opera its ubiquity, but also kill opera, because like through gramophones, people don't have to go to the theater anymore. So this is kind of a fascinating story at the intersection of several worlds, and this is also a good example of the model that I use for each object that I deal with in the book.
So all the objects that you examine as technological inventions permeated mass consumption to create modern men and modern women. History and ideologies appropriated them and reshaped them. So which object or objects do you think have had the long-lasting influence on the shaping of 20th and 21st Italian culture and made in Italy?
So the objects I deal with are objects that appear in the market, on the market like 100 years ago, and they continue to influence our daily life. So wristwatches are still very much part of our daily experience. Bicycles too. Gramophones have evolved into more miniaturized forms. And what I do in observing objects as they develop 100 years ago is to observe actually how in 100 years people will look at our own objects, the objects of our time. So if you think about the last 50 years, so TV, the phone, the internet, that we can observe only once we have a certain distance. So in a way, to observe the plethora of inventions that invaded the Italian market between the 19th and 20th century is also a way to read the plethora of inventions and objects that invaded our time over the last 50 years. Now, some of these objects are, the objects I deal with are part of literature, cinema, also contemporary literature and cinema. If I were to pick some of the iconic objects, so actual products that define Italian modernity, certainly we would recognize some of the leading brands like La Moca, Bialetti, or the Ferrari, and this is something I've been dealing with a lot in the podcast Italian Innovators. What I trace in the art of objects is the origin of a certain behavioral way of producing objects, of producing things with attitude. This behavioral way affects all the creation of the most iconic Italian products that we all know and are familiar with throughout the 20th century and the 21st.
So thank you very much, Professor Cottini, for being with us today.
And thank you for having me.
And thank you very much for following us.